Are you? But would you critique the one who is okay with everything you just said, but they don't necessarily, let's say kiss an icon for religious convictional purposes? Maybe they're just not there yet, or they don't see it. Is that like an issue? But they don't deny like everything you just said.
Well, I think the attitude is off maybe from the outset, because it's not a question of do you in your I mean, I know this for you, it's a question of conscience and whether you're convinced of it yet. But from the vantage point of the Orthodox Church, like, we're bound by the teaching of the church. So the Seventh Ecumenical Council lays down the canonical principles of how we do icons and what holy objects are. That's what's going to guide our attitude towards what people are taught and what they have to accept. So in other words, if you're going to be Orthodox, you don't get to have like, well, I'm going to have the halfway position on icons. Well, that would deny the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and then thus that would deny the doctrine of the church. So any denial of dogmas or of councils ultimately ends up undermining the church itself, and that's why it doesn't work to say, oh, I'm 70% Orthodox. Oh, I believe 90% of the Nicene Creed. It's all or nothing. And they all hang or fall together, right? That's why you see, for example, at Nicaea, they argue that, well, if you deny homoousios, you lose the gospel, right? And the semi-Arians argued, well, that's not necessarily true. We're not full-on Arian. We're just semi-Arian, and that's an okay midway position. No, it's not. According to Nicaea, there is no halfway on the deity of Christ, right? So in the same type of logic, you can't have half the Orthodox faith or 70% of it. That's what underlies ecumenism, right? The whole basis of Vatican II's ecumenist approach, and by extension, Protestant ecumenism, is let's find the lowest common denominator, couple doctrines or dogmas that we can all agree on, and that's the church. But the church is not mental assent to propositions that you find convincing. The church is a living community that exists from the time of the apostles onward. It's not a set of propositions that you either find convincing or not.
I mean, shouldn't Protestants just become part of the Baha'i faith? I mean, isn't it basically the same thing?
Well, that is what I was arguing the past couple streams was, where is the Protestant epistemic principle for what the lowest common denominator is? In other words, you were busy, but when I was critiquing IP and God logic, it's like, you can't just say, well, the true church is whoever teaches, quote, the Bible. I mean, okay, so does that include the churches that are ordaining women? Is that a true church where I can find the grace of God? Well, you're going to get a different answer from all the different Protestants, because for them, that's not necessarily, for most of them, that's not a dogmatic issue. Well, but wait a minute. Why is it not?
Yeah, exactly. They can never answer. And then we're intolerant. So it's totally fine for them to exclude JWs and Mormons or whoever else.
Right.
On some arbitrary criteria. Oh, see, they don't believe fill in the blank. They don't believe fill in the blank, but that's what's in question. What's the criteria? Like, what are the necessary conditions that you have to fulfill? Well, obviously, it's what I say.
Yeah, exactly. But see, that's the point, is like, but where's the epistemic criteria for that? And it's like, well, because I read the Bible. Yeah, but every Protestant says I read the Bible. So that's not a good epistemic criteria that's public and objective that we can all look to and see, yes, you're correct. This is why. Because the Bible is not a self-interpreting book. This is what FDA is always pointing out. The Bible doesn't.
And I saw that, Alex Soren, are you out there somewhere? I saw that you used my argument, and that it's the argument we've been using for a long time. There's no way that a book can have normative authority.
Right.
Because they say sola scriptura isn't that they deny authorities, or it's just the scripture alone. It says that it's the highest authority. But that doesn't make any sense to say that a book has normative authority, because it's not a courtroom. Right? They say, well, it's the word of God, God speaking. But that's the problem, though, is how is that publicly worked out? If they're not living people who can pull up somebody in court and say, no, you have the wrong interpretation on this. So it's just going to result back to solo scripture, that it's like, well, obviously the normative authority is me, because God's speaking to me. But again, we're back to the same place, is that, well, how is it resolved publicly? A text can't say, J. Dyer versus blah, blah, blah. We hold you in
contempt of court. You're in contempt of Protestant court.
You contempt of Protestant court, right? So the only way that we can speak about it is being authoritative would simply be just like the secular philosophy books on my bookshelf, or whatever books are back there or behind you. You can speak of them loosely as authoritative, but guess what? You get to pick whether you cite those or not, and whether you're going to have them be authoritative.
Right. Now I've got
that's what Protestants do with. So you can't have the Bible be the ultimate authority if there's not a living body to actually enforce it.
And remember, as we pointed out, if you're in the Protestant, simple reformanda type of mindset, every generation has to reinvent the wheel. You can never have a settled case because, well, they might have been wrong, right? Like the previous generation, nobody was infallible. So every generation will have to reinvestigate the Trinity, reinvestigate the doctrine of the deity of Christ, the sacraments, so just think how silly this would be. Like you can never get anywhere because every generation has to work through all of the same problems all over again. Now, in regard to icons, again, because this is, I guess Gavin Ortland decided this. I'm not sure, because he seems to be the leading sort of deciding voice on this. They've decided that icons is the end-all, be-all line of argument. This is all they ever go to. Now, I want to go ahead and give you guys the shortcut. You can get Michael Garton's book, and I'm sure that since we're going to do this David Wood debate in the upcoming near future, in a few months or whatever, you get Michael Garton's book, and I think volume 2 is out or is about to come out. And that's going to give you a 300-page assessment of icons or the veneration of relics and imagery in the first 300 years. But I'm going to give you guys a shortcut to where you can actually bypass even the patristic stuff. Not that you have to, but for the sake of, quote, Protestants, because they don't care ultimately what the church fathers say, because if you find, things proving your case from the church fathers, they'll just hand wave and dismiss it until they find one single thing that they think proves their position from the church fathers, by the way. And this is the documentary that our good friend Lewis made over at Orthodox Shahada. Of course, we've talked about this for so many years because it's really, in my view, the best way to approach this. Rather than trying to figure out, okay, where is the council in the year 300 that says you have to have icons? If something is already there as the sort of normative practice of the church, we don't necessarily have to have, nor should we expect, some written dogma about said thing. In fact, it might not even be mentioned until it becomes a controversy. When you begin to read the church fathers, when you study the history of the early church, many scholars you'll see this everywhere. They'll note that most of the time dogmas are a response to a controversy. So just because...
what council, Jay, condemns torturing people?
This is a good way to approach it. Exactly. Right. So just because something's not mentioned, it doesn't mean that there's not some existing normative approach to it. It's just simply not written, right? Or may not be written, or it might be written and later discovered or translated. We just haven't discovered that yet. So all those things are possibilities. But when it comes to worship, precisely because the Bible itself is a document that's part of the worship service, we wouldn't necessarily expect that everything in the worship service would necessarily be committed to a written text like Paul's epistles. So the Protestants from the outset have a false assumption that anything that would be believed as normative has to be written in some textual, formal way in the first, second, and third century, or else it doesn't count.
That's very modern.
That is a modern approach. Exactly.
Also, I'm glad that he's actually... I think it's a good thing he's focusing on iconography, because that's exactly what defines a Christian or not.
Exactly. No, it actually works to our favor.
There's no way that you can even be loosely called a Christian if you do not venerate icons, because the only way to have proper Christology is through the theology of the icon.
Exactly. Exactly. And this is the entire reasoning of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, especially when you read St. John Damascus's Defense of the Holy Images, and when you read On the Holy Icons by St. Theodore the Studite. Both of those books, when you read them, you'll realize, oh, this is integral actually to Christology. And the Seventh Ecumenical Council is kind of a capstone on a series of councils that almost entirely focused on Trinity and deity of Christ, right? All of those are building on each other, and they sort of culminate. I'm not saying there's not an eighth and ninth council. I'm just saying that the seventh council culminates the Christological capstone, you could say, of early church first millennium Christology. You don't really get another development of, quote, Christology. The only thing you get after that is the energies doctrine of the Palamite synods, which relates to Christology, but pretty much Christology is complete by the Seventh Council because the iconographic principles all underlie both the sacraments and the doctrine of the church and Christology. And they all stand or fall together. Now, what Protestants don't get, and this is what I had a really hard time grappling with when I was Protestant. I'm a Calvinist dude. I'm studying Greg Bahnsen and John. I read all the 1559 Institutes of John Calvin. I was super Calvinist dude. And I remember beginning to read the Church Fathers, and I'm noticing, wait a minute, they're talking about liturgy pretty early, right? You got St. Justin Martyr describing a liturgical worship service. He doesn't give you the actual service, but he's clearly describing a liturgical worship. And then I say, oh, St. Hippolytus is talking very early about them wearing vestments. You've got apostolic succession being mentioned by Irenaeus. You've got all these principles and points that are very problematic for me as a Protestant coming up. And then lo and behold, I'm gonna have to read the post-apostolic fathers, right? So I go and read Ignatius and Clement. And then I come to the martyrdom of Polycarp, right? Which you can dispute whether that's 2nd century or whatever, but it's still very early, whatever you date it. And that's all about relics. And it's like the Christians are treating the body of St. Polycarp more important than gold and silver. So I was at an impasse when I'm seeing this stuff as a Calvinist, rabid devotee of Greg Bahnsen and Cornelius Van Til. And I'm like, what am I going to do with this? So you kind of come to a juncture, and you either have to say, this is the process that everybody goes through. You either go the route of the Anabaptists and say the church died. You have to be some form of restorationist. And I was already pretty familiar with, Reformation doctrine wanting to have continuity, right? All the magisterial reformers wanted to have continuity with the early church. So that never seemed like a plausible option to me to go Anabaptist or whatever. So the next thing you do is say, well, I'm going to have to figure out how I can maybe make the church fathers into proto-Anglicans, right? Or perhaps some high church Lutheran or something like that, right? You try to come up with ways. And I remember at a certain point, I was like, maybe the Doug Wilson, James Jordan, we're going to be Calvinists, but we're also going to have a couple candles, and maybe we'll wear a white vestment, and we'll have a little bit of incense at the beginning of the service. But then you realize it's like, so is this just everybody makes it up? Like Doug Wilson can make up a liturgy the way he wants. You can be Reformed Baptist. Oh, but you can also be like James Jordan and basically dress up like an Anglican. It's like, this is crazy. So there's no established principle of worship. And the other thing about being a Calvinist, which was helpful in this regard, was Calvinists who are, strict Calvinists, they believe in the regulative principle of worship, which is laid down in the Westminster Confession as this idea that we can only worship God in the way that he lays down. And clearly in Leviticus, when we read Leviticus 10:11, you read about Nadab and Abihu, you see that that's the principle there, right? God doesn't allow Nadab and Abihu to just get creative and offer the incense the way that they want. In fact, they get struck dead for that. So it's like, seems like it's pretty important for, like the order of the service and what you do. So where is this? Like where in the New Testament is there the actual liturgical service that's to be done? And I remember thinking, why wasn't this there? Like in the New Testament, you have Paul critiquing people abusing the service in the book of the Corinthians. But how were the Corinthians just supposed to make it up? Like, were they just supposed to say, let's all get together, all the elders in the congregation, and we're going to just make up a worship service the way that we think is the most God honoring, right? But then I decided, okay, I'm gonna have to read liturgies. I'm going to read liturgists, okay? And Protestant liturgists were admitting all these things that I didn't want to admit. They were admitting that the early church had liturgy. which if you're a Calvinist, that's already getting to be a problem, right? So I'm thinking maybe I'm going to have to just become an Anglican. I never went Anglican, but I did read some Anglican books. I read Peter Toon and Bishop Ussher, and there was some other, there was a Lutheran liturgical guy I remember reading back in the day. So I thought, well, maybe I got to go like some kind of halfway type of thing, because I cannot find this puritanical Calvinism in the early church. But then you start to realize when you're reading Protestant liturgists and Protestant historians about the formation of the canon, oh, actually, the liturgy is a big part of how the Bible came to be. That was a big problem, because now I'm having to admit that the actual Bible itself is actually a liturgical document. When I learned that from Protestant scholars, then I was in a real bind, because now I'm having to rely on a tradition that's not explicit or in some formulation in the first, second, and third century for the Bible itself, right? And then you find Protestant scholars saying, yeah, the daily lectionaries were a very important thing for the formation of the biblical canon, which took many centuries. Once you realize that the canon is not formalized universally in the early church for centuries, now we have a huge problem for sola scriptura. How is the church able to function, grow, thrive when, number one, most of these people are illiterate? And number two, they're not operating on the principle of sola scriptura. You guys all saw James White admit that in his debate with Trent Horn. That's a huge admission. I'm not a fan of Trent Horn, but I mean, James White's admitting that for the first several centuries, sola scriptura was not the normative principle for the church. Yes, they cited the scriptures, but there was not a completed canon. So first problem with all these people is when they demand first, second, third century written proof for iconography, they don't live up to that standard. Where's the first, second, third century written proof of the Protestant canon of scripture? It doesn't exist. I tried all these arguments. I used to be a Protestant. I used to be a Calvinist. So I know all these arguments. I know in and out all of the different angles and the different roads and the paths that people are going to try. The halfway house of Anglicanism. I'm aware of all that. But the problem is that the more you get steeped in the church fathers, the more you read the Cappadocians, the more you read the post-apostolic fathers, the more you read the Latin fathers, the more that you start to read the canonical teaching of the church, of the councils, the local synods, you start realizing, man, there's no Protestantism here. It's not there. Even if I try to quote mine and find, I see people today doing the same thing I did 20 years ago. They'll go to St. Clement of Rome, where he says, our salvation is by grace, it's not by our works. Oh, there we go, that's Luther. No, that's not Luther, because an Orthodox person could say the same phrase and not mean Luther's nominalistic PSA doctrine. That's why you realize, as you get hopefully a little more sophisticated, that it's not really a battle of competing quote mines, because all of these texts have to be interpreted. And everybody knows that you can't interpret a text by taking one sentence outside of its context. Hopefully everybody knows that, right? So then I realized, well, I'm going to have to actually start reading all of these church father writings. Not that I've read them all, but I have read thousands and thousands of pages of church fathers. This is what I did in my 20s. I had a job where I was able to read most of the day, and I did that all the time for about 10 years. So I read a lot of church fathers for 10 years straight. And it just became more and more difficult to remain a Calvinist, especially when I came to the conclusion that, man, if the Bible itself is a liturgical document, that's kind of a kill shot for sola scriptura and the Calvinist regulative principle of worship idea. So guys, we've actually made a documentary that's a shortcut that Lewis made 4-6 years ago. By the way, it just hit 100,000 views. So props to Lewis for that great documentary. And this is based on the Williams and Anstall book about the Orthodox worship service kind of coming out of the temple and synagogue liturgies. It's based on the Hugh Wybrew book, who's an Anglican scholar and liturgist about the history of the Byzantine liturgy, the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. And we find, lo and behold, all of what we would expect if the early church was liturgical, it's already there from the Bible. This is what people miss, is that there's multiple places throughout the Bible itself that already give us indicators of the type of worship, not an actual liturgical worship service, but indicators of how they were doing liturgical worship from these biblical principles. And then lo and behold, by the time of the 200s and 300s, we begin to have actual liturgical texts themselves. If I recall, the oldest is, I think, the Liturgy of St. Mark that we have or know of in terms of, but the fact that that's from the 200s or whatever it is, that doesn't mean that that's when it was invented. That just means that's the earliest textual version that we possess. Protestants, about to blow your mind here. Do you realize that we don't possess Paul's letters? We don't have autographa. We have later copies that the church preserved. The same church that preserved and copied Paul's letters is the same church that preserved the liturgical worship services. So to say that there must be a first century text of liturgical worship or second century, nobody can actually keep that standard, much less with the Gospels and the epistles. I don't recall off the top of my head what the earliest text of Paul is, but the earliest...
It would shoot him in the foot when it came to Scripture. It's like, well, then Scripture's disqualified.
Well, also, so like the earliest New Testament text is the Gospel of John fragment that's 90 AD. And it's just a little fragment. It's like hardly any of it, right? So that means that we don't even have John's autographa either, because we don't know that that was a text that John himself wrote. That could have been a copy, right? I mean, if it's dated to 90 AD, that's obviously around the time.
By the way, it doesn't matter the date, because if you get to 4th century, 3rd century, they're like, that's not early enough. I mean, you can get it back to the 1st century and be like, no, it has to be within 5 years of...
Yeah, well, it says who? Like, it's just, they just keep moving the goalposts.
No amount of, like, because I'm like, well, dang, to me, I'm like, that's awesome. That's so early that... And they're like, no, it's not early enough.
Well, that's what I'm saying is like, it's arbitrary. They'll just keep moving the goalposts. Yeah, this is it. So the earliest known fragment is the Gospel of John, called Papyrus P52. And it's dated around 100. They don't even know the date. They think maybe it's 100, maybe it's 150. Okay, so that's pretty late according to what you're expecting for icons. So you understand your own expectation for what has to prove quote unquote icons in liturgy isn't even the standard for the Bible, you goobers. You want to see what it is? That's it. That's it right there. That's the earliest thing. It's this little fragment. It's not even a chapter. It's not even a paragraph. It's like part of a paragraph of the Gospel of John. And it's called the Rylands manuscript, the P52 manuscript. If it's 100 to 150, then that's not, presumably John didn't actually write that. So how are you going to apply that standard to the very thing that you're saying is the ultimate final authority? So go watch the documentary. That Lewis put a bunch of time and effort into making this little mini documentary. Everybody that watches it finds it to be just absolutely devastating. And this is the actual principle behind iconography. When you understand this, what's in this documentary, the icon stuff makes perfect sense. You don't even have to go into this wild sort of like goose hunt to try to find, snipe hunt, to try to find all of the supposed mentions of, you know, where in 243 AD was there a specific mention of the icon of Saint so-and-so? Like, you don't have to do that because they're already reverencing the relics. So the relics are the same principle as the icons. Don't you see? And it's not out of nowhere. It's out of Hebrew proto-Christianity. The Old Testament is Hebrew proto-Christianity. The liturgy of the Orthodox Church is the liturgy that develops out of, and but I say develops, I don't mean the Roman Catholic doctrine of doctrinal development. I mean the apostolic, quote, development that Jesus gave the apostles the authority to do, right? To set up a proper order of worship based around the principles of the temple and synagogue service. And this makes perfect sense because the development of the synagogue system under Ezra is itself based on the temple, right? It's kind of a mini little temple style of worship. It's only natural that since the church in the first 10 chapters of the book of Acts comes out of the synagogue, of course it's going to have this synagogue temple principle behind it. But here's the thing, this is exactly why we have Messianic Judaism Protestants and why we have classical Protestants and 1,000 different Protestants. How do we know what elements continue over? Protestantism has divided many times over many things, but one of the things that has continually divided Protestants is worship itself. How do we do it? Can we have instruments? Should we have an altar? Can we use Doritos and crackers and grape juice? I mean, all these different things that many Protestants actually do. There's no clear epistemic principle, again, in the Protestant world to figure out from the New Testament alone what things carry over into the worship of the church, because there's not an explicit worship service. There's no liturgical document in the New Testament that tells us what the service is. There's only rebukes of existing abuses of some service that existed. So the New Testament itself points to the fact that there's already an existing liturgy that's not written down, which shows that our position is actually the biblical principle, that the liturgy is not the same thing as the Bible. The Bible is part of the liturgy. Thus, the apostolic tradition itself has to be the thing that determines what carries over after the apostles die, that's proper for the church, and what is fulfilled in terms of being Judaic or Mosaic in its administration. So, incense, will that carry over? We don't know. Vestments, will it carry over? We'll have to see, right? Protestants, even to this day, are still dividing and splitting. In fact, the entire CREC church that Doug Wilson created split precisely over paedo-communion, vestments, altar, and liturgical worship. When they created their denomination back in 2002 or 3 out of the Auburn Avenue Presbyterian Conference, they had this conference saying, as Presbyterians, we have no basis to not believe in paedo-communion. So just that itself tells you that this was already decided in the Orthodox Church from the beginning. We always gave infants communion. You guys are having to reinvent the wheel, redo all the basics, but you're inventing your own church that's, quote, following the Bible. But you're admitting that, oh, well, it turns out the Orthodox Church was actually always following the Bible. Literally the only way that we could solve this question is on the basis of apostolic tradition. Where do we know? How do we know what that is? Where are we going to find that? Well, guess what? That's where the liturgical tradition comes in. That's where the canonical tradition comes in. Local synods, ecumenical councils, teachings of the church fathers. All of those are going to play a very important role in figuring out and seeing in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century what elements are there, what elements carry over, what things were considered Judaic and fulfilled, and which ones weren't. Yes, Acts 15 in part will deal with that. But Acts 15 is only talking about the reception of Gentile converts and what they're supposed to submit to. Acts 15 doesn't tell you how the worship service is conducted. Acts 15 doesn't tell you how we get bishops. It doesn't tell you what elements of liturgy should and should not be done. So you can't just say, well, we look to the book of Acts. Okay, well, when the Orthodox Church looks to the book of Acts, we see chrismation. Most Protestants don't do chrismation. So how is that going to work to just say, look to the Bible, look to the Bible? Everybody believes they're looking to the Bible. Every sect, every heretic forever has always said, I'm just going by the Bible and what the Bible teaches. Even the Orthodox, even the Roman Catholics, everybody's going to say, yeah, we go by the Bible. Okay, but how do we know that we've got the right interpretation? How do we know what these elements are? That's why we have to go to the apostolic tradition. And what's amazing is how many times Protestant scholars, evangelical scholars, end up admitting this stuff. And I don't care about Anglicans. They're pretty nasty, but they actually have served a really great role for us in being a pretty consistent pattern of scholarship that admits so much about liturgy and the history of the liturgy that's pretty devastating and damaging for a lot of the Protestant world, right? If you're an evangelical or a low church Baptist Protestant or a strict Calvinist, these Anglican liturgists are a stumbling block. They're a problem because even though we're not trying to prove Anglicanism, they serve as a pretty decent reminder to the Protestant tradition that the early church is liturgical. The early church has a calendar. They're celebrating very, very early in the 180s, I want to say, Easter, right? We have one of the earliest controversies in the church is the Quartodeciminarian controversy about when we celebrate Easter. That's a liturgical feast. That means the church has liturgy, dude. They have a church calendar. There's a huge split in the church. In fact, it was so bad, Pope St. Victor wanted to excommunicate all of the East. And then St. Irenaeus rebukes him and he backs down from doing that. I mean, we don't think he had the authority to do that anyway, but you see how big this liturgical controversy was in the 2nd century. Well, guess what? Protestants, that means that they're doing liturgy right there in the 2nd century. So we're not but a few decades from the apostles, and we've already got a liturgical controversy splitting the church. So obviously the church is liturgical in the 2nd century. And by the way, I have all of these Protestant scholars. I have all of Alfred Edersheim's books. I have a whole shelf of Anglican, Roman Catholic, and Protestant liturgists. Because I realized that, like, if this falls, it's over. If the church's liturgical worship is based on the principles that we see, for example, in the Temple of Solomon, and no, I'm not saying that every aspect carries over, like we're going to be blowing the shofar like John Hagee, but this is the proto-worship of the church. Why would we expect anything different? Why would we expect that the church wouldn't have a very similar style of worship to the temple and the synagogue? And Lewis does a great job here of laying out the traditional architecture of the church versus the architecture of the temple. And he goes up throughout church history to also point out what elements that we see of the synagogue, which is supposed to be a kind of a mini temple, how that obviously influenced the church and what you see in the early church. As everybody should know, the Dura Europos synagogue also demonstrates this principle as well, that Judaism was not iconoclastic. This is a huge misunderstanding. People think that rabbinic Judaism is absolutely today's rabbinic Judaism or medieval rabbinic Judaism. They think, oh, that's identical to all forms of Judaism all the way back to Moses or Abraham. No, it's not. Most Jewish scholars today will admit, whether it's Schaeffer or Boyarin or Sommer, they will admit that Judaism was very diverse, both in BC and in the 1st and 2nd century. It's not until the 3rd and 4th century that rabbinic Judaism begins to codify its anti-Christian stance, that it becomes more and more iconoclastic. As you can see, the Dura Europos synagogue, which is, I think, 2nd century, 2nd or 3rd, is not iconoclastic. It has all sorts of iconographic imagery all over the wall. It looks just like an Orthodox church. Now you could say, well, this is just a one-off. These were the Jews that were into idolatry. Well, did the temple have imagery all over its walls? Did the Ark of the Covenant have imagery? Lo and behold, why would you not expect that the church, as the fulfillment of the temple, would have all of that principle, but then the Jesus saint elements over it? Of course it would. Because it is the fulfillment of that. That is the type. This is the fulfillment. Anyway, so Lewis goes through all of this in terms of the church's structure, its layout. But it even comes down to the vestments that we see priests and bishops wearing. And these aren't made up either. They're not arbitrary. Again, we find very early in the church, in the 2nd century, in the 3rd century, we find multiple references to things like incense and vestments. And when I was a Protestant, that surprised me. I did not expect that to be there. I had the same assumption as every Protestant does, that the early church, because they were in, quote, houses, that had to be low church. But then I went to the catacombs in Rome. I mean, I already believed this because I read it, but I went and saw it for myself in the catacombs in Rome. And it's not just one-off catacomb. You understand, the catacombs are massive. You can't even see all the catacombs in like a week. You'd have to spend multiple weeks to see even what's known in public of all of the catacombs in Rome where the Christians were hiding and were worshiping because they were persecuted. And lo and behold, there's imagery and altars there. Every Protestant iconoclast needs to go to Rome and visit the catacombs, because you're going to see, and all of the historians and all the guides are going to tell you, these are images from the 2nd and 3rd century. In fact, they were already doing pilgrimages very early, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, to these sites because so many people were martyred. But where is this in the New Testament? Well, this is a huge point of departure between us and the Protestants when it comes to interpreting the book of Revelation, because it's pretty consistent also when the church fathers, who don't often talk about the book of Revelation, but sometimes when they do, there are also liturgical references in the book of Revelation. For example, when John looks into heaven, it's on the Lord's Day, so he's actually doing the liturgy. He sees the lamb slain in heaven. Wait a minute, I thought it was once for all Protestants. Why is the lamb slain bleeding in heaven? Why is that imagery there? Wouldn't that undermine the Protestant doctrine of, when Jesus said it's finished, my friends, it is finished? Why is he still shown as a lamb bleeding in heaven? Why do we see liturgical worship in heaven? And then I remember reading a bunch of books back in the day about the Hebrew liturgy. And I remember reading this little thing called the Elior Abstract. You might still be able to find it. She's a Jewish woman who's a historian of the Jewish liturgy. And how she says, well, it turns out that the Jewish liturgy that Moses set up, not talking about later Rabbinic Judaism, but Moses' idea of the tabernacle, it's based on a copy of the things in heaven. So if that was the copy, what's the reality? Oh, it's this. Jesus's church is the fulfillment of the temple and of Israel and that whole administration. So if that's the type, the fulfillment will also have the same imagery. Thus, when we read Revelation 5 through 9, that heavenly liturgy, which is the liturgy on earth, has saints, has an altar, elders, vestments, censers of incense, all of that. And then once I saw that, it was over, right? I guess that's right. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Roman Catholics, as you guys know, but there is one Roman Catholic book that I would recommend on this. Scott Hahn's book, The Lamb's Supper, because he makes a very convincing argument that even early on in the church, they were beginning to understand that John's vision of Revelation 5 through 9 is in a liturgical worship service. Uh-oh. And if the church's worship is that heavenly worship, not the type that Moses had, but the reality that Jesus brought, then it's over. It's over for the Protestant low church mindset. Then I read another Roman Catholic, but when I was Roman Catholic, I read another book that was a big one. And that's the Roman Catholic liturgist, Father Meagher. And I'm only recommending these because they make some good points that don't contradict the Orthodox view. How Christ said the first Mass. When I read that as a Roman Catholic, that really also further solidified that, oh, okay, this makes perfect sense, that a lot of what Jesus is doing in the upper room is actually fulfilling what the high priest did, right? So we think of this probably because we watched, Jesus of Nazareth and these kind of Protestant made movies. That might have been a Roman Catholic made movie. I don't remember, but we see all these Protestant movies and whatnot, and we think, oh, that's, Jesus was just this dude walking around in sandals, and then the poor, apostles, they were all just poor dudes and basically proto hippies, and so they would have just been like sitting around the fire and doing like Bible study, bro. That's the mindset, right? And obviously, a house church has to be proto hippies just sitting around being peaceful or whatever. No, it's not. It's all wrong. I was wrong about that. All of that was wrong. This will reverse that. So I do recommend, I don't recommend Scott Hahn typically, but if you were to read one book from a Roman Catholic that makes this point, it would be The Lamb's Supper by Scott Hahn. You could read Father Meagher's book on how Christ said the first Mass. And you will see, again, all of these. This is all biblical stuff, dude. The only reason those books are good is that they're proving the point biblically that I'm making here. And I'm sure there's plenty more Orthodox books. I've got a bunch of Orthodox liturgical books as well. I'm not trying to distract from those, but I'm just pointing out, you're going to find out that all this stuff was way earlier than you thought. And, that's just what Gavin and all these people are going to have to come to terms with. You're going to learn that the Eucharistic liturgy comes out of the Jewish breaking of bread tradition. It comes out, the anamnesis, right? Once for all sacrifice is represented. It's not a re-sacrificing of Jesus, killing him all over again. You're going to notice that a lot of these Jewish ritual elements that did carry over are there very early in the church. So